All right, this hearing will come to order. Welcome, everyone. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on Chinese and Russian influence in the Middle East. I thank our witnesses for appearing here today. I will now recognize myself for the purpose of making an opening statement, and then we'll turn it over to the ranking member to do the same. Thanks so much to our witnesses for testifying today and for helping us examine patterns of Russian and Chinese influence in the Middle East and North Africa. In the fall of 2015, Russia launched a targeted military intervention in Syria to save the regime of Bashar al-Assad and ensure access to military bases on the Mediterranean Sea. Moscow has used this foothold to assert its interest throughout the region, to expand its political and military and economic influence, to reclaim its status as a great power, and to offer itself as an authoritarian alternative to the United States. In recent years, Moscow conducted military exercises with Egypt and sold Cairo more than $2 billion worth of aircraft, cooperated with Saudi Arabia to stabilize global oil prices, expanded ties with Khalifa Haftar in Libya, engaged in discussions to sell the S-400 missile defense system to Qatar, and strengthened relations with both Iran and with Israel. China has also expanded its influence in the Middle East and North Africa in recent years, although in a different way. China's engagement has been primarily economic, rather than military or political. Since 1995, the region has been China's #1 source of imported petroleum. China overtook the United States as the largest net importer of crude oil from the Middle East in 2013. By 2018, roughly 44% of China's crude oil imports came from 9 Middle Eastern countries. Every major regional actor, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, has expressed interest in various projects of China's Belt and Road Initiative. If history teaches us anything, China is likely to increase its political engagement and expand its military footprint to secure these economic interests. Indeed, in 2017, Iran and China held a joint naval exercise in the Persian Gulf, and just last month, Egypt hosted the Chinese and Russian navies in a training exercise. China began operating its first overseas military base located in Djibouti in 2017, providing a greater naval access to the Red Sea, Gulf of Aden, and Arabian Sea. The expanding regional roles of both Russia and China are of particular importance in light of the Trump administration's national security strategy that prioritizes great power competition. Under this paradigm, rivalry with both China and Russia will become the organizing principle of U.S. foreign policy. Yet we continue to see unprincipled China policy and deference to Russia. The administration's announced withdrawal from Syria was a gift to Putin at a time when clear-eyed American leadership is what's clearly needed. The Middle East and North Africa may become an arena of strategic competition to an extent not seen since the early years of the Cold War. I hope our witnesses can draw upon their experience and share their insight to help us understand Moscow and Beijing's strategies in the region, where our interests overlap or diverge, and how the United States should approach Russia and China's roles in the Middle East and North Africa. And with that, I will turn it over to the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, for his opening statement.
Chairman Deutsch, thank you for calling this important hearing. China and Russia's increasing presence in the Middle East underscores the necessity of American leadership in the region. Beijing and Moscow are engaged on all levels in the Middle East and North Africa, political, military, economic, and beyond. And they're planning for the long haul, raising serious questions for U.S. interest and policy in the region. As we delve into this discussion, we must also bear in mind that China and Russia's engagement in the Middle East is not only meant to increase their clout and influence in the region, but to decrease America's influence. Indeed, China and Russia are eager to take advantage of fissures between the U.S. and our traditional allies. They seek to portray themselves to our regional allies as viable alternatives to the U.S. while deepening their involvement in the region at our expense. Under Chinese President Xi's leadership, China has expanded its engagement in the region dramatically. Beijing has dedicated considerable focus on the Middle East as part of the controversial Belt and Road Initiative. China has invested in nearly every country in the region, including in Israeli ports and railways and the expansion of the Suez Canal in Egypt. Even more concerning are China's technology initiatives in the region. While the United States has voiced concern about Huawei, ZTE, and other technology firms, our friends in the Middle East seem happy to integrate Chinese initiatives in their technology sectors. In 2019 alone, Bahrain, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE have already engaged with China on telecom and 5G infrastructure. Although China's activity in the region has historically focused on economics, under President Xi, Beijing has also increased its military footprint. As Beijing deepens military ties with traditional U.S. allies in the region like Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and the United States must make it clear to our partners that collaboration with China comes as a significant real-world consequence. Late last year, the U.S. Navy announced it would reconsider port calls to Haifa, Israel, once the Shanghai International Port Group, a company in which the Chinese government has a majority stake, takes over the civilian port in 2021. Like China, Russia has been strengthening military and diplomatic ties with our traditional Middle Eastern allies for years now, seeking to cement its role as a regional power broker. Since Russia's 2015 intervention in the Syrian civil war in support of the Assad regime, Moscow has also built strong economic ties with Saudi Arabia and Qatar, sold billions of dollars to arms to the UAE, and cultivated close ties to President Sisi of Egypt. Russia's Middle East strategy has been to cultivate those ties with all actors, both U.S. friends and foes, in service of its ultimate goal of dominating the region and undermining U.S. interest. Moscow has depended on its relationships in recent years with Iran, Hezbollah, Turkey, Israel, as well as the rival Palestinian and Libyan factions. And as Russia's role in the region continues to grow, actors in the region will feel less inclined to heed to U.S. interest, like respect for rule of law, democratic institutions, and human rights. While Russia and China appear to be real viable alternatives to the U.S., whether it be military, politically, or economically, the region will move toward authoritarianism and away from democracy. I hope our expert witnesses today can address these crucial issues. How can the United States continue to advocate for our democratic values in the Middle East without pushing our friends and partners into the arms of Russia and China? There is simply no alternative to U.S. leadership. We must redouble our efforts to deepen ties in the region and caution our allies that full-scale engagement with Russia or China is not in their interest. The Middle East faces many challenges already, but if we fail to face the increasing Chinese and Russian influence in the region, things will only get worse for the people of the Middle East and for the United States and its interest for freedom and democracy. I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the ranking member. I'll now recognize members of the subcommittee who wish to be recognized for a 1-minute opening statement. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing, and of course, thank you to our witnesses for being here today. As it has in so many parts of the world, in the Middle East, the Trump administration has forfeited American leadership in an ongoing series of diplomatic and strategic blunders that have set back our standing in the region, not to mention the world. The administration pulled out of the Iran deal with no replacement, leaving an emboldened Iran that indicates it will return to its nuclear program. The administration's Syria policy is virtually non-existent. In Saudi Arabia, the Trump administration has embraced a government that has had a journalist hacked to death. In Yemen, the United States is supporting a conflict that has led to unspeakable human suffering and inflamed tensions in the region. The list of failures goes on and on. The lack of a clear U.S. strategy and diplomatic engagement in the region has created a vacuum China and Russia are already exploiting. This is making the region less stable. It's emboldening human rights offenders who take the administration's ambivalence towards human rights as a green light to crack down on civil society, further discriminate against women and LGBTQ individuals, and silence free speech. Today, I hope we can discuss the risk to American security as well as the risk to human rights posed by a rising Russia and China in the Middle East. I look forward to examining what Congress can do to support human rights activists in the region and to ensure the administration promotes American interests as well as our values. In the absence of a strategic vision by the administration, Congress must step up on behalf of the American people and set forth a path in the Middle East. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, again, for calling this very important hearing, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Seeing no other requests for opening statements, We'll move on without objection. All members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to length limitations in the rules. It's now my pleasure to introduce our witnesses. Dr. John Alterman is Senior Vice President, holds the Zbigniew-Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and is Director of the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He previously served in multiple roles at the United States Department of State as an expert advisor to the Iraq Study Group, and before entering government, he was a scholar at the U.S. Institute of Peace and the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. In addition to his policy work, he teaches Middle Eastern Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies and the George Washington University. Next I will turn to my colleague from Texas, Mr. Allred, to introduce his constituent.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am excited to introduce Dr. Andrew Exum, a constituent of mine from Dallas. Dr. Exum is an executive at Hackett & Company, a global management consultancy. Before that, he served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy from 2015 until 2017. And previously, he served active duty in Afghanistan and Iraq, where he led a light infantry and ranger platoons, and later served as a civilian in the Department of Defense on a fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Exum, thank you so much for coming, sir. We have some friends in common who have spoken highly of you. I'm sure everything they said is not true, but we're happy to have you here, and thank you for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Allred. It's worth pointing out, as a member representing South Florida, that many of the witnesses who appear before our committee one day will ultimately reside in my district as well. Next, it's my honor to introduce Undersecretary Christine Warmoth. Ms. Warmoth is the director of the RAND International Security and Defense Policy Center and is a frequent writer and speaker on foreign policy, national security, and homeland security issues. Prior to joining RAND, she served as Undersecretary of Defense for Policy at the United States Department of Defense from 2014 to 2016. She previously served in multiple roles at the Pentagon, including Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Strategy, Plans, and Forces, and Senior Director for Defense at the National Security Council. And she was Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Welcome, Ms. Warmoth. Finally, Ms. Anna Borshevskaya is a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, focusing on Russia's policy toward the Middle East, a PhD candidate at the George Mason University, and a Fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. She was previously with the Atlantic Council and the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a former analyst for a U.S. military contractor in Afghanistan. She has also served as communications director at the American Islamic Congress. Welcome, Ms. Borshevskaya. Also, Dr. Exum, I would also extend my welcome to you as well. Thanks all of you for being here today. Let me remind our witnesses to limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Without objection, your prepared written statements will be made part of the hearing record. Again, we thank you so much for being here today, and Dr. Alterman, you're recognized.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, it's an honor for me to appear once again before this subcommittee. It's important to grasp that China's approach to the Middle East is both deliberate and limited. My understanding of Chinese foreign policy is that alongside the overarching desire to restore China to its rightful primacy among world powers is a profound sense of China's vulnerability and insecurity. China has no missionary zeal to persuade the world of the virtues of Chinese civilization. The Chinese government's goal is to secure itself, best done in a world driven by the bilateral relations of states. China, a country with no allies, is much stronger in a bilateral world. The United States, a country with dozens of allies, is much weaker in a bilateral world. China feels especially vulnerable in the Middle East, reliant on the Middle East for oil, dependent on its sea lanes, and unable to change the fact that the United States is the preponderant foreign power in the region. In my judgment, China has no intention of displacing the United States from the Middle East, confronting the United States in the region, or engaging in a rivalry with the United States there, and it sees no reason to do so. It feels that stabilizing the region is beyond its reach, and doing so would likely do more to antagonize potential partners than advance stability. Instead, China is happy to have the United States incur costs in the region while China derives benefits. In the Middle East, China benefits from high hopes and low expectations. China is a newcomer to the scene with relatively little history, but a domestic economic track record that's enviable by almost any measure. In some ways, China is in the place that the United States was after the First World War, a dimly understood global power holding out the promise of a better future untainted by an imperialist history. China also promises not to disrupt social values in societies undergoing profound change. That is, China promises access to the Chinese economic miracle while expressing none of the Western concerns about fostering systems that produce resilient societies. The China model has become even more attractive to Middle Eastern governments after the Arab uprisings of 2011, which reminded governments of the perils of more open political space. Further concern that growing U.S. energy self-sufficiency will draw the United States away from the Middle East calls for these countries to put in place a hedge. You could argue that China is devising a new mode of imperialism, whereby imperialism 1.0 was imperialism, European-style imperialism. Imperialism 2.0 was the U.S.-led rules-based international order, and imperialism 3.0, or you might call it mercantilism 2.0, is a set of wholly interest-based government-to-government ties that allow the rapid exploitation of economic opportunities on what is, at least initially, a consensual basis. China represents a challenge for Western governments that seek to push governments to fight corruption, pursue technical excellence, and encourage environmental stewardship. China advertises that it provides a quick shortcut to resources. Of course, China is not relying on economics alone to advance its interests. China also deploys traditional statecraft to advance its interests and confound its adversaries. As I described in my written testimony, U.S. policy toward Iran is a multi-splendored gift for China. China is also pursuing close ties with 4 other Middle Eastern countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Israel. Each offers something different, and despite differences among all of them, China maintains close ties with all of them. China's regional strategy is elegant in its simplicity, and it seeks engagement based almost entirely on economic cooperation. The United States, by contrast, is engaged broadly and deeply around the world, seeking to foster the sort of long-term changes that help generate economic growth and political liberalization in South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Germany, and elsewhere. The sting in the U.S. model is it hasn't led to similar development everywhere. The Middle East, Latin America, and Africa are full of examples where U.S. development efforts failed to meet their goals. China is promising a different approach and a different set of results. We don't know yet how well this all will work. China has a light military footprint around the world, and its expeditionary capacity is limited. That means China may have difficulty securing its interests and protecting its large overseas population, which numbers as many as 600,000 in the Middle East alone. China may find that being a global power with global interests carries high global costs as well. In addition, a more checkered track record may take the bloom off the image of Chinese investment, and governments and populations may come to feel coerced into accepting economic agreements that favor Chinese interests over host country interests. What neighbors interpret as Chinese aggression tends to draw neighbors closer to each other and seek closer relations with the United States. In addition, the whole Chinese economic model may collapse under its own weight. But from a U.S. perspective, we need to be mindful that the Chinese model may pose a formidable challenge. As I see it, China sees us pursuing an expensive and obsolete model of global influence. They don't want to defeat us, they want to marginalize us. To me, the biggest danger we face in the Middle East is assuming our adversaries will confront us in the ways we're most prepared to be challenged. Facing insecurity, we double down on troops and materiel. Confronted with hostility, we respond with force. For decades, our strategy has been hegemony, which is becoming increasingly expensive to sustain. We don't really have an economic strategy. China seems to harbor no hegemonic ambitions in the Middle East and finds the doors thrown open to its influence. It seems to me that we have to rethink our approach to the region, not as we've done for 50 years. What we have done is try to lead the world to a better future rather than reinforce the status quo. And, sir, I suggest that we need to continue to make the world a better place now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Alterman. Dr. Exum, you're recognized.
Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, thank you so much just for giving me the opportunity to come here to speak to you today. It is a privilege to represent the great state of Texas and the 32nd Congressional District, which is ably represented by Colin Allred. Thank you so much for that warm introduction. If it's okay with you, I'm just going to summarize my prepared remarks before the committee. As some of you know, from 2015 to 2017, I was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East policy. I do not have any type of background in Russia. I don't speak Russian. I've never even been to Russia. But in the summer of 2015, we assessed as a department and as a government that the Assad regime in Syria was nearing something close to collapse. And thanks to the benign guidance of Christine Warmoth, we assembled a kind of tiger team within our office to go over scenarios that we called catastrophic success. In other words, what would it look like if the Assad regime collapsed, overnight, or collapsed very rapidly in a way that would in some ways be welcome, but in other ways would seriously endanger U.S. interests. Now that's what we saw from a five-sided concrete box in Northern Virginia. I imagine that the Russians and the Iranians saw something that was much more real and much more imminent from their perspective, and that is what I believe led the Russians to double down in Syria in the fall of 2015 and to surge a lot of troops there. Their stated motivations for going into Syria did not line up, unsurprisingly, with their revealed motivations. Stated, they said it was all about counterterrorism. We assessed that their revealed motivations for going into Syria at the time ranged from, yes, counterterrorism was part of the reason why they were there, but mainly they were there to prop up their allies. Tactically, they are dependent on the warm water ports in Tartus and their presence that allows them to project power into the eastern Mediterranean. We also assessed that kind of strategically, this was about the Russians saying enough, especially after UN Security Council Resolution 1973 and the way that was used to overthrow the regime in Libya. Russia, which has always feared and has greatly resented the color revolutions and the Arab revolutions, the Arab Spring, which they saw the United States and its Western partners as being behind. This was a way for them to draw a line in the sand and say that's not going to happen anymore. They also used it as an opportunity to build their own coalitions. Part of this was to say, yes, you, America, you have a 48-nation coalition, but we, Russia, we also have a military coalition, and you need to look at us as a peer, as somebody that's worthy of being taken seriously. And then second, and perhaps most importantly, this was in some ways Russia's entree back into the international community after the isolation which accompanied the invasion of Crimea. The decision about whether to talk to the Russians about Syria was a controversial one within the administration. I and many members of the Department of Defense were not in favor of this. From my perspective, I viewed Russia as arguably being the least important member of their coalition, that coalition which included Hezbollah, Iran, the Assad regime, and that even if we were able to reach some sort of accommodation with the Russians, I didn't think they'd be able to deliver on it. By contrast, we could deliver our coalition. Second, we believe that they would use these negotiations as a way to buy time and space for them to pursue their true military objectives. Again, they said this was about counterterrorism, but in point of fact, we all knew where the terrorists were. The Jabhat al-Nusra was in the northwest of Syria. We had the Islamic State in the east. Russia concentrated its military power in recapturing those key urban areas such as Aleppo and Damascus that the regime valued. They were 100% aligned with the regime's overall goals. However, in the negotiations, I will confess that we found the Russians to be relatively scrupulous. It's a quirk of Russian bureaucracy that they will actually lie to one another. So you could be talking to a Russian general or intelligence officer or diplomat who will be presenting in good faith what they believe to be the case when you know it's not the case. And this leads to the second point, which is I also think they use these negotiations, and we were very conscious of this at the time, to not only find out what we knew about Syria, but find out how we knew what we knew about Syria, because they were very interested in the sources and methods that we've been able to develop, quite frankly, over the Cold War. In the end, I have to say that, although we in 2016 somewhat chuckled when we saw the Kuznetsov, Russia's only aircraft carrier, belching across the Mediterranean en route to Syria, the Russians were successful in Syria. And the way they've used that success and the success of their coalition has essentially been to tell our traditional partners in the region The United States is a fair weather ally. We are with you fair or foul weather. We are an all-weather ally, and Russia and Syria is the proof. And I remember when I left the Army and went to graduate school and was studying the Middle East, when we talked about the Russian presence in the Middle East, we talked about it as a historical artifact. That's no longer the case today. It wasn't the case when I returned in 2015, but Russia is here to stay, and for many of our traditional partners, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Egyptians, dealing with Russia as a member and as a presence in the region is quite simply not optional. I'm happy to take your questions on more about the negotiations or about how we view the Russians, but I'll do so during Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Exum. Ms. Warmoth, you're recognized.
Good afternoon, Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, members of the committee. Thank you so much for offering me the opportunity to be a part of this excellent series of hearings. I really commend you for the light that you're shining globally on the role of Russia and China. China and Russia's increased engagement in the Middle East in recent years underscores that the United States is in a new era of strategic competition, one that's taking place at a time when many Americans are understandably fatigued with the role of the United States as leader and world's policeman. So I wanted to offer a few thoughts as a bigger frame, maybe, to talk about what's at stake at this competition and what are the players competing for. For the United States, I think our goal is to ensure our continuing prosperity and security in an increasingly complicated and contested world. Russia, on the other hand, a country with a very strong military but a deteriorating economic picture, seeks to preserve its status as a great power for as long as it can. China, on the other hand, fueled by its tremendous economic strength, is pursuing a long-term strategy aimed at restoring what it sees as its rightful and traditional historic place as a world power. To prevail in the competition, Russia is basically trying to disrupt the international order, reestablish what it sees as its rightful sphere of influence, and to weaken the cohesion of our transatlantic relationship with Europe. China sees the United States as trying to contain its rise and wants to both reestablish its primacy in Asia relative to us and also adapt the international order to better accommodate its preferences and objectives. Looking at Russia and the Middle East specifically, it sees its presence there as a way to highlight its status as a great power at a time when America's influence in the region is seen as waning. Moscow's strategy, as my colleagues have said, rests on maintaining good relationships with all the countries in the region and really focusing on maximizing its opportunities while minimizing its potential for losses. Moscow is deeply concerned about the potential for the spread of Islamic extremism to Russia, and in Moscow's view, the Arab Spring, as well as our interventions in the region, have destabilized it significantly. Russia presents itself, in contrast to the United States, as a reliable partner that won't lecture about human rights or societal freedoms, but is very interested in trade, investment, and energy with the countries there. Sustaining its transactional approach to the relationships in the region is getting harder, though, for Russia. While Syria didn't turn out to be the quagmire that former President Obama and others predicted, Russia's military involvement there is in its fourth year, and there is no diplomatic resolution in sight to the conflict. While Russia's involvement in Syria could be seen as at least partially successful, it doesn't appear to have the economic power or the appetite, I would argue, for robust expeditionary military operations that would enable it to pursue a more comprehensive approach to the region. For China, the Middle East is probably the most important region of the world outside of Asia. China seeks recognition from the countries there of its status as a rising power and sees its relationships as an opportunity to balance U.S. influence. They appear to be pursuing a strategy grounded in Beijing's policy of non-interference abroad, also, like Russia, emphasizing positive relationships with everyone there while avoiding becoming entangled in the region's many conflicts. The engine of China's deepening involvement in Middle East is its continuous need for energy and its access to economic markets. Countries in the region welcome China's investment, but 5 years into the Belt and Road Initiative, there are some emerging signs of concern, whether it's about debt sustainability or environmental impacts or others. While China is an economic heavyweight in the Middle East, it's much more of a lightweight, frankly, militarily, with really only the small military base in Djibouti that the chairman mentioned. So before saying a little bit about what this means for U.S. in the Middle East specifically, I'd like to emphasize that the United States needs an overarching vision for success in the strategic competition. We need to develop a comprehensive strategy that leverages all of the instruments of our power, whether it's economic, diplomatic, military, or cultural. Discussions of our competition with Russia and China have really emphasized the military dimension, and that's important, but equally, if not more important, is the economic piece, is figuring out how are we going to reinvest in our economic health and our educational system so we can continue to be a world leader in technology and innovation. Similarly, we need to develop a more comprehensive approach with our allies and partners to just thinking about how we're going to compete with Russia and China, and we need different approaches. Those competitions aren't the same. The current administration's preference for bilateral approaches fails to take advantage, I would argue, of one of our biggest strengths. I would agree that Russia and China, while they want to demonstrate their status as a great power in the Middle East, they don't want to displace us entirely. We need to emphasize consistency in our approach, emphasize that we're not leading. We need to pay attention to the BRI projects and address concerns we may have to those projects that may have implications for our presence in the region. And finally, I would argue we need to avoid overreach if we're going to compete successfully. Almost 20 years of our military operations, many of them in the Middle East, have led to not only the deaths of thousands of American military personnel, but they've also eroded our standing in the world and frankly created opportunities for Russia and China to make gains at our expense. So as we think about any future decisions for use of force in the Middle East, I think we need to learn from our experiences in Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan and think hard about our vital national interests.
Thank you, Ms. Warmoth. Ms. Borshevskaya, you're recognized.
Thank you. Chairman Deutsch, Ranking Member Wilson, honorable members, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. In my written testimony, I have gone into detail about Russian President Vladimir Putin's strategic objectives in the Middle East and North Africa, how those work against our own national security interest, and to that end, I touched very briefly on China. For the sake of brevity, let me summarize. Vladimir Putin ensured Russia's long-term prominence in the Middle East and North Africa. Washington must now take Moscow into account in the region to a degree it hasn't had to for years. The Kremlin is primarily concerned with its own survival, which it views as intrinsically connected to its relationship with the United States, and more broadly the West, in a zero-sum search for great power status. For Putin to win, the US has to lose, and Putin needs victories, especially given the trajectory of Russia's domestic politics. A long-term military presence on the Mediterranean appears to be a critical component of Moscow's goal to deter the West. Thus, in Syria, from the very beginning, Moscow's actions showed it sought to methodically create an anti-Axis aerial denial, so-called A2AD layout, to deter the West. This position provides Moscow with greater leverage over NATO's southern flank and creates a springboard for further activities. Moscow benefits from low-level conflict in the region and has an interest in perpetuating it. This situation necessitates Moscow's presence, elevates its importance, creates opportunities to sell weapons to all sides, and gain leverage over all players to create dependence on the Kremlin. Thus, Moscow manages conflict, but doesn't bring a genuine resolution. It is thus wishful thinking that Moscow, for example, will restrain Iran in the region. In this context, Moscow's approach to the region is flexible to ensure a position of a power broker. The Kremlin courts every major player in the region, and increasingly they court Moscow. American allies from Egypt to Turkey, Israel, the JCC, and Morocco, to one degree or another, have come to see Putin as a necessary reality, a mediator who can talk to all sides and offer a more reliable partner than the United States. Key areas of cooperation are political, military, economic, including energy, diplomatic, and soft power focused. Not only does Turkey continue the discussion about the purchase of the S-400 from Russia, a purchase that appears to reflect reality rather than mere posturing, but Russia is also building Turkey's nuclear power plant, while Sputnik plays an important role in Russian information operations in the country. Moscow has managed to pull Egypt closer into its orbit through arms, nuclear energy, and economic deals. Russia also inked agreements with Morocco that include cooperation on nuclear energy. Moscow projects power without incurring significant costs as it continues to improve Russia's military capabilities, boost arms sales to the region, and develop economic ties in the energy and other sectors. Meanwhile, Washington's overall commitment to the region remains ambiguous. To touch very briefly on China, Beijing's involvement in the Middle East thus far has been primarily economic. The Russia-China dynamic is complex, but specifically in the Middle East, Beijing has sided with Russia and also seemed happy to have Moscow take the lead in the region. China's involvement holds major strategic implications for the Middle East, but so far Beijing has not expressed a desire to be a power broker or a security provider there. I made a number of policy recommendations in my testimony, which I'd like to summarize. First, compete for the region. What happens in the Middle East rarely stays in the Middle East. We increasingly talk of realignment towards great power competition, but in this context, the overall retreat from the region that began under the Obama administration continues. This situation makes it easier for our adversaries to step in, and indeed, this is what Putin has done. Second, we need to craft a clear strategy of dealing with Russia. Sanctions alone are no substitute for policy, and to be sure, they are an important tool and we should keep utilizing it, but as part of a broader strategic vision that involves multiple tools. To that end, we also have to promote a clear narrative. Moscow has much appeal in the region. Putin's worldview that runs counter to democratic value resonates in the Middle East. The U.S. has yet to counter it effectively, especially in the context of our own internal polarization and self-doubt. Lastly, we have to remember that there are no quick and easy fixes, but with strategic and moral clarity, the U.S. can reclaim its leadership position and succeed in the unfolding great power competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Borshevskaya. We will now move to member questions under the 5-minute rule. I'm actually going to defer until later, and we'll start with the ranking member, Mr. Wilson, and then alternate between the parties. Mr. Wilson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
And thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And beginning with Dr. Alterman, has China's treatment of the Uyghur population and stance on Syria negatively impacted public opinion in the Middle Eastern countries? I'd like a view from each of you. Dr. Alterman.
Congressman, it is remarkable how little public comment there has been outside of Turkey, which has an ethnic tie to the Uyghur population. I think this is a consequence of the fact that governments in the Arab world generally have very tight control over the press. Governments have decided for reasons of diplomatic interests and economic interests, they don't want to antagonize the Chinese. And they have been pointedly silent in many cases about the oppression of the Uyghurs and the collection of perhaps 1 million Uyghurs into what appear to be concentration camps.
And Dr. Exum?
No, I have nothing to add to that. I think that's exactly right. I think the most notable thing has been the silence of the large Arab states with respect to the internment of the Uyghur population.
Thank you. Ms. Warmoth?
I would just add, I think I would absolutely agree with Dr. Alterman that because the government has such control, there isn't a lot of public discussion of it. But I think to the extent that Arabs, if you will, on the street, that Muslims on the street are aware of it, it is probably quite unpopular. It's also worth noting, I think, that the Chinese diplomats place a lot of emphasis in their interactions with officials in Middle Eastern countries, basically saying, don't criticize us publicly. That's one of their diplomatic goals, and they have been, sadly, very successful to date.
And Ms. Borchesaya?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that was said. It is the silence on this issue in the region has really been quite remarkable. And I agree also that the Chinese diplomats indeed press this issue over and over again. What's also interesting is it is rare that the Chinese, when in public, Chinese diplomats would talk about their own Muslim minority. It's as if it does not exist.
And Ms. Borcheskaya, you have referenced this about the development of nuclear facilities by Russia. What has been the level of involvement of Russian nuclear energy sector investments? And is there any, what is our ability, and I want each of you to answer this too, for the United States to compete?
Sure. So with Turkey, as far as I understand, the construction of a nuclear power plant has already started. With Egypt, there was an agreement signed several years ago, and there's planned to begin construction in about 2 years. And Russia is helping Egypt finance the construction. They're essentially giving them a loan. With Morocco, the agreement is more tentative. There's simply been an agreement on nuclear cooperation. It's unclear where that's headed, but the very fact that it's taken place is significant.
And back again, what can the United States do to compete?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to being, for one, to get Egypt, for example. Egypt used to be our partner in nuclear energy security. That's not the case anymore. I think, again, it goes back to a consistent presence in the region, demonstrating to the region that we're committed, that we're not leaving the Middle East. The major issue is that so many of our allies are hedging bets, that they feel we are very much ambivalent in what we want to do.
Thank you. And Ms. Warmoth?
I think I would just add, one, the advantages of having U.S. companies provide nuclear cooperation, energy cooperation, for example, is that our technology comes with, a very high level of sort of safety and regulatory standards. So I think that's on the positive side. I think, the really big competition right now, as I understand it, is around Saudi Arabia's desire to build a number of nuclear power plants. And I think the concern that I would put on the table there is that in signing a 1-2-3 agreement, we really would like the Saudis to basically say, we're interested in doing this, but we're not going to enrich uranium. And right now, as I understand it, Saudi Arabia has not been willing to include that kind of a provision in a potential 1-2-3 agreement, which is particularly concerning in light of the fact that Mohammed bin Salman has indicated that if Iran gets a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would want to build one as well.
And very insightful. Dr. Exum.
No, that's right. I actually think that U.S. firms are doing a pretty good job in terms of marketing themselves to the Saudis. And I think the administration has helped with that. But I think as the Honorable Ms. Warmoth noted, that there are sticking points that, frankly, that the administration should hold firm on. We also have leverage. The Saudis are wanting to invest in our energy infrastructure going forward. I think that's largely a positive thing. The Saudis also want continued access to advanced weapon systems. That's also in large part, that could be a potential chit for negotiations, but I'd turn it to John for other thoughts.
Congressman, we could drop standards and constraints, but I don't think we should. I think the reality is that then the Saudis or the Egyptians or somebody else may go to a supplier that doesn't impose those constraints. But I'm not sure we should stand in the way of that because the constraints are important.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Mr. Cicilline, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Exum, Brett McGurk, the former U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIS, recently wrote, and I quote, "The United States must recognize that Russia is now the main power broker in Syria. Washington has no relations with Damascus or Tehran, so we'll have to work with Moscow to get anything done. Russia and the United States have some overlapping interests in Syria. Both want the country to retain its territorial integrity, deny a safe haven to ISIS and al-Qaeda, and both have close ties with Israel," end quote. Do you agree with that assessment? And if not, why not? And if you do, kind of what is the best way forward in light of that observation?
Sure. Well, I mean, first off, let me just say a few words about Brett McGurk, who I think is one of the most significant U.S. diplomats over the past 20 years. I mean, the things that Brett has done in Syria and in Iraq, really, he's been a tremendous servant for the past 3 administrations. Brett and I disagree on this particular issue for the reasons that I think I just laid out. It's true that Hezbollah and Iran and the Syrian regime don't necessarily want to speak to us. That doesn't mean necessarily that we should speak to the Russians. And again, the sticking point that I would have is that while it might be tempting to believe that the Russians can deliver on cooperation in Syria, we didn't see any of that evidence in 2015 and 2016. Frankly, we saw the Russians and their coalition partners use the ceasefires that we were able to negotiate to rest, refit, and reprioritize for other military objectives in Syria. Frankly, I do believe that we do share some interests with the Russians, and we do have some key interests in Syria, namely countering terrorism, the security of the State of Israel, especially in southwestern Syria. However, I do not believe that Russia shares broader interests with us going forward, and I would have serious reservations about what that cooperation would look like. During 2016, we floated the idea of joint targeting of terrorists with Russia, which caused a significant amount of heartburn in my building in particular, because the idea of sharing intelligence with the Russians, I mean, the idea of marking intelligence secret rel Russia was just, It was almost impossible to even imagine. I believe Russia desires to know a lot about our sources and methods that we have spent decades developing. And with all due respect, and I hold Brett in the highest regard, especially for his service in Iraq, I would disagree with him strongly about the conclusions that he's reached. I just don't think that Russia can deliver, and I think they have a lot more to gain than we do.
Thank you. Mr. Warmoth, I want to turn now to the Iranian influence in the region. We heard from Secretary Pompeo just about a year ago when he presented what he called a new Iran strategy, laying out 12 very basic requirements, and as best I can tell, none of the conditions he set out has actually been achieved. And I'm wondering whether the withdrawal from the Iran deal has done anything to limit Iranian influence in the region, and whether or not this maximum pressure policy is working at all, and frankly, and more particularly, what message that has sent to Russia and China in the region. I know that's multi-layered, but.
Yes. Well, my own sense, I did not think it was in our national interest to withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal. I think in light of the circumstances, that was the best deal we were going to get, and it did put off for many years the possibility of the Iranians getting nuclear weapons. That said, what I think has happened now is the conditions that Secretary Pompeo has laid out, I don't think Iran has any intention of meeting. By withdrawing from the nuclear agreement, we, I think, have disappointed several of our European allies, and frankly, that's become a bit of a wedge issue with them. And the circumstances that we're in now, I don't see a year into withdrawing from the nuclear arrangement that Iran has abated any of its malign behavior in the region. If anything, we seem to see that escalating. I think as they become more and more frustrated with the economic pressure they're under, they are lashing out more and more, and I think that's very concerning. So where we are right now, I think, again, as Dr. Alterman alluded to, our policy, I think, has actually been helpful to the Russians and the Chinese because it's created so many wedges for us and hasn't really done anything to address the instability.
Thank you. And just my final question. Civil society and democracy activists in the Middle East face increased challenges, from the suppression of opposition voices to censorship of the press to discriminatory laws and mistreatment of marginalized communities. And over many administrations, our country has stood up to balance our very regional strategic interests in the region with our need to stand up for important democratic values. The Trump administration has decided in many ways just to ignore democracy and human rights altogether, and cozying up to governments such as Saudi Arabia, which jail women and hack journalists to death and silence free speech. And I'm just wondering, with that kind of disregard for human rights, whether the emergence of Russia and China in the region, kind of how that impacts it. Dr. Alterman?
Congressman, I think a very important part of China's Middle East strategy is to make the future safe for authoritarianism. Mm-hmm. We have had a different strategy for more than a half century, but the Chinese strategy is to make the future safe for authoritarianism because that will help secure the current government of China.
If I just, may I just have one quick follow-up?
One quick follow-up.
How does the change in the kind of behavior of the current American president impact that strategy, if at all?
I would hope that we would work through a multilateral framework to build alliances with governments that both have governments working with us in broad concert, and also make clear to governments that there are standards and issues of pressure that the U.S. will not compromise. I think we have friends in that. We should have friends, and people should want to be our friends because they understand the U.S. package is a better package, and the reality is that many governments, especially in the Middle East, believe the Chinese package is a better package for their future.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Mass, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Exum, Rangers lead the way. That's right. Listen, I love this committee. It saddens me when I hear just these irresponsible comparisons about the administration cozying up to Saudi Arabia. Numerous administrations going back forever have these relationships. Anybody could go out there and say President Obama working a deal with Iran is cozying up with, the greatest human rights abuser that's existed, in this modern era. And so it does sadden me to see that as part of this committee. I think it's wholly irresponsible. Beyond that, I would also say this. If any of my colleagues on this committee think that we should go out there and have further engagement in Syria, then I would encourage them to author an authorized use of military force in which you very specifically lay out exactly how many U.S. lives, U.S. limbs, U.S. treasure, anything else that you're willing to risk in advancement of anything that you see as a goal in Syria before you go out there and spout your irresponsible remarks. In that, I would like to move to the conversation of China a little bit and some of the comments that were made across the board. China is assessed by everybody to be a massive economic strength. It's been mentioned in nearly everybody's comments as we have hearings like this across the board in different subcommittees. Everybody talks about China's economic prowess. Dr. Alterman, you spoke a little bit about maybe the lack of desire for China to go out there and play that hegemonic stability role throughout the Middle East. Number one, it costs them in treasure. Number two, they have to go out there and pick winners and losers and perhaps lose allies where otherwise they don't have to pick a friend or a foe or an ally or otherwise. So what I'd love to hear you all comment on really is hearing your analysis in that paradoxical situation is it better or worse to let them or maybe force them into having to play a hegemonic role throughout the Middle East? Does it push them into a place that they don't want to be, which can be good for the United States of America? Or is it better that we continue to maintain that hegemonic role or spend our treasure and our life to maintain that hegemonic role, in your opinions? You could start on whatever end you want.
I'll take a swing at that, Congressman. I think we should frankly try to have China take more responsibility and be more a part of the security discussion in the region. I mean, they have basically been free riding off of U.S. security guarantees in the region for some time. They're able to get the energy they need out of the Middle East because we have historically secured it and made sure that there are free flows of oil.
Does that occur by asking nicely or by forcing them into a position where they have to maintain stability?
Well, I would say this. I don't think, my own view is we should not try to force them to participate in that. I don't think you could do that. And again, in many areas, we don't necessarily share the same interests. That said, I do think we could continue to do, for example, under the Obama administration, we did go to the Chinese and say, be a part of the anti-ISIS campaign, participate. You all tell us all the time you're worried about terrorism, you're worried about the spread of Islamic extremism, so come and work with us together, to fight this common threat. They were not willing to do that at the time, but I think we should continue to ask them. Again, we also asked them to be a part of the response to Ebola, which obviously was in Africa, not the Middle East. But again, our message, I think the message of the United States to China should be, if you want to be a great power, you need to act like a great power and work on some of these common security challenges.
Certainly.
If I could add, when we started shared awareness and deconfliction exercises off the coast of Somalia for counter-piracy, the Chinese first said, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And then finally they decided to start coming, and then we said, okay, we got the problem fixed. We're going to stop holding them. And the Chinese said, please keep holding them. So the Chinese have been willing to engage a little more militarily. I'm concerned that we and the Chinese are playing very different games, and we continue to invest very heavily in military presence, security ties, and we become hived off from the genuine national interests of the governments in place. I think, in a way, we've been carried too much by momentum, and as I say in the written statement, having grown up in Poughkeepsie, New York, a company, a town really nurtured by IBM, I'm particularly aware that IBM kind of lost the computer market because they concentrated on the wrong piece of it, and they let other companies develop things that were much more remunerative. I think we have to rethink what our role in the Middle East is, what are our tools, and how do we make ourselves vital to governments. I think we're going to have to rethink part of how we engage in the region.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your comments and your testimonies today.
Thank you, Mr. Mast. Mr. Allred, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panel. Read your written statements and learned a lot, and I think this is a very important topic. I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this. As we're kind of tilting now to world power competition, I see the Middle East as just an extension of what we're seeing even in our own hemisphere, but certainly around the world. And so I want to kind of talk about how we counter influence and how we can do that in a way that is consistent with our economic values as well, but also militarily. And so I want to begin with arms sales because, as you're aware, China and Russia are selling arms to our allies, and we've even seen some of our arms in Yemen, for example, ending up in the hands of al-Qaeda. And I'm wondering if we have any concerns, or if you have any concerns about China and Russia getting access to classified information or to any of our military systems, and better understandings of that, and how and what the Congress can do in mitigating the risk of to U.S. military equipment to try and prevent that. Ms. Warmoth, do you want to take it first?
Sure, happy to do that. I think what we see with Chinese and Russian arms sales, more probably Russia than China, of course it's a source of revenue for them. But what I saw happen over the last few years is as the countries in the Middle East become less confident of whether the United States is going to be there, become frustrated, frankly, sometimes with the conditions that we put on our arms sales, which we do so in most cases for very good reasons, they have essentially engaged in hedging behavior, and sort of they look particularly at Russia as an alternative. You know, when Egypt got really fed up with us for not selling them things because of the conditions that Congress, among others, put on those sales, they turned to Moscow. And I think that will keep happening, I think, unless we do a better job of making it clear that we are staying in the region and that we are reliable. They may not like everything that we have to say to them, but I think right now countries are not really sure exactly what our approach is. I do think we want to be concerned in any time we're engaging with arms sales in putting in protections to make sure that the technology is not leaking or being proliferated. And there are a lot of mechanisms already in place, but I think to the extent that Congress can emphasize the importance of those conditions in the various sales that the administration may be contemplating, those are very important.
And so just to follow up really quickly on that, because you touched a little bit on the restrictions that we put in place and the things we ask of our allies. On this committee, we've been talking a lot about our kind of withdrawal from global leadership on human rights and standing up for those, especially in this region. Do you think it's possible to maintain that commitment and to carry that goal while also continuing to partner in the way that we have on arms and others by perhaps, as you were saying, making sure they understand that we are here to stay, we're going to be part of this, expressing some sort of overall strategy?
I think it's important that we continue to have human rights and basic freedoms be an important part of our foreign policy, frankly. And I think that should be part of our conversation with countries in the region. So while, frankly, when I was in government, it was sometimes a struggle as we were trying to work through decisions about whether to go forward with sales, given constraints that Congress had levied on us. Those are important things, I think, to weigh, and I would encourage Congress to think about, I do think you want to give the executive branch some wiggle room to make judgments about what the right balance is between the human rights conditions and other things, or democratization things, and sales, because sales are an important part of our relationship. But I think having some conditions in place, it's good to have those guardrails for the executive branch.
Yeah. Dr. Exum?
Yeah, if I could just add one thing. I mean, I think over the past 30 years, we've had this theory of the case that if we build up Gulf especially host nation security capacity, then we will be able to remove some of those 35,000 roughly U.S. troops that are in the Gulf. I think 59,000 in the region alone, so it's a huge investment in our case. The challenge, to my mind, the strategic challenge is if you build up that host nation security capacity, they might actually use it, and that's been the case in Yemen, right? Our end-use monitoring regimes are pretty darn good if the weapons are in garrison. If they're deployed in an expeditionary fashion, it gets tougher to keep track of exactly where all those weapons are going. I would echo everything that Ms. Warmoth said. I think that the Senate has done a good job in forcing a binary choice on Turkey with respect to the F-35 and the S-400. Another area that I would put on your radar is that the restrictions that we have, some of them for very good reasons, on unmanned aircraft and UAVs means that they're bringing in Chinese or Russian UAVs, often with Chinese or Russian engineers in close proximity to advanced U.S. weapon systems. That's something that I think the Congress can take a hard look at to make sure that the U.S. Department of Defense and the Department of State are keeping appropriate distance between those weapon systems and foreign nationals.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Trone. You're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. China, they built their first overseas military base in Djibouti. How effective do you think this base is in projecting power in the Arabian Sea and the Red Sea? Who wants to take a stab?
Congressman, I don't think they can really project power, but it certainly helps their surveillance. They partly are watching us because we're right next door. But they care an awful lot about shipping through the Red Sea, through Bab el-Mandeb, off the coast of Yemen, and then up through the Suez Canal. And this is their first overseas base, of course, which is a big thing to say. And it is largely about just keeping track of the shipping. I don't think it's really a force projection so much as it is to understand the flow, to do surveillance, to be present more than to actually be able to act. The Chinese are still a little bit scarred that they had to suddenly evacuate 30,000 people out of Libya when Gaddafi fell. They had never done anything like that before. They're not going to be able to do that out of their base in Djibouti, but it begins to represent a spreading out for the Chinese Navy.
So if this is the first, which it is, where do you think they're going to build a second, or will they be building a second? And what are they trying to accomplish? Just more listening, surveillance?
They are certainly investing in a port in Pakistan called Gwadar that has a sort of Chinese industrial zone behind it. I don't know anybody who thinks that base that port makes sense economically, given how much the Chinese are putting into it. There's a Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor that is part of their strategy. One of the problems that Chinese have as they expand westward and down through Pakistan is it partly takes them to the Uyghur populations that we were talking about earlier with Congressman Wilson, which is a security problem, but also brings you into some nasty areas of Pakistan. Certainly one of the things that the Chinese strategists have expressed concern to me about is as you go west through the Uyghur areas and down through Pakistan, you may be setting up a highway for radicals to come into China instead of get goods out of China. So how well that's all going to work in practice is unclear, but certainly the Gwadar port is something that people, when I wrote a book with co-wrote a book with a specialist on China more than 10 years ago, he was paying a lot of attention to Gwadar. Gwadar is still in early stages, so it's not moving that fast, but it's certainly something that draws a lot of attention.
So if we looked at the container operations they set up in Abu Dhabi, in addition, and we know Athens, they've done the port in Athens, they've done 2 ports in Israel. I mean, is this all part of it seems like it's the entry points everywhere they're grabbing the ports. Is this infrastructure part of Belt and Road? Still surveillance is your best guess is where they're going with all this?
Well, they're certainly interested in trade. The report gives them an opportunity to talk about win-win. What amazes me about the Belt and Road, frankly, is how little money they've put into the Middle East and how much benefit they've gotten out of the Middle East, because everybody projects their country to be the central node for the Belt and Road in the region. So the Iranians, I think, are getting a lot of investment and are very enthusiastic about it. And that there's something I talk about in my testimony about the sort of way China thinks about Iran. But the Egyptians are very enthusiastic, the Emiratis are very enthusiastic, the Saudis are enthusiastic, the Qataris are enthusiastic. Everybody seems to think that Belt and Road is going to put them front and center with a rising power in the world. And I think, frankly, the United States hasn't had a counter to it. We tie people up in regulations. It all seems tedious.
Let's jump over to technology a second with Huawei. We talked, you may have talked about that already before I missed it, but I mean, with Huawei, they're taking over the communications gear. They're low bidding it to get in and get down and buy I'm a business guy, to buy into the market. I mean, what dangers do you see in our intelligence and loss of data privacy?
I think some of my other colleagues may talk better. It's a profound issue and gives them profound insight should they choose to use it.
I think, Congressman, I would just add, the concern I think that we have to have front and center with Huawei is the fact that it is essentially it's not a state-owned Chinese company, but it is probably a state-directed Chinese company. And hence, anything like that, if they have a global presence, if you will, and posture into the 5G network, for example, the Chinese government is going to have access to that as a result of the fact that Huawei is a state-directed company. And I think that's the reason we have to be so concerned about that. I would encourage the administration to really start thinking in a comprehensive way about how do we talk to our allies and partners around the world, whether it's in Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, to help level set everyone to what the threat is so that we can have a more coordinated.
So you believe it compromises our data that's being transmitted through the 5G eventually?
I'm no IT expert, but I would be very concerned about it based on what I know.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks again to the witnesses. I want to just go back to Russia and comments that were made earlier. Russia is an all-weather ally, a reliable partner that won't leave. And Ms. Borshevskaya, you talked about Iran. We can't expect them to affect Iran. I want to talk about Russia and Iran. What do we make of where the relationship is going? We know of Russia's relationship with Israel and the agreement that they seem to have reached, where Israel is able to do what it needs to do to protect itself. But what should we expect of Russia? Can we expect Russia to play any role in helping long-term with the Iranian presence, Iranian malign activities, or when you say they don't lecture, should we just expect the relationship between Russia and Iran to grow stronger? Yeah.
Sure. So first, there's oftentimes when the conversation starts about Russia and Iran, there's an emphasis on the history between these two countries, and the history is one of largely animosity. The problem is that that's increasing. That has not been relevant in the last several years, and certainly Syria in particular brought the Russia-Iran partnership to new heights. And frankly, if you look at what Russia did in Syria, one reason why they've been so successful in Syria is because they've relied on Iran to do all the heavy lifting. So, back when the intervention started, many had thought that this would be another Afghanistan for Russia. The reason why it wasn't is because Iran did the hard work. Russia is interested in trade with Iran. Hezbollah has learned from Russia. They've operated side by side. There have been reports of Hezbollah using a Russian flag as a cover to avoid getting hit by Israel. Hezbollah have traveled to Moscow. Putin had invited them to Moscow. So the Russia-Iran partnership, really it's unprecedented in the grand scope of the history of these two countries in 500 years. Now, at the same time, Russia certainly has good relations with Israel, and that is important for the Kremlin as well. Kremlin has been able to balance these relationships, and as you said, they've reached an agreement. Israel has been able to conduct its strikes, but at the same time, Russia by its very presence, by its nature of presence in Syria, is able to collect intelligence on Israel, not just on the U.S. and the U.S. coalition, but also on Israel. And certainly, you know, the fact of the matter is Israel's freedom of action is dependent on Russia. Yes, they've given it, but they're dependent, and I think that's the point. So,
Thanks, Ms. Prescribe. Ms. Warmoth, let me just go to you on this. Is there longer term, should we expect this relationship to grow?
I'm not sure that it's going to grow. It strikes me that the Russia-Iran relationship is complicated. You know, in the short term, Iran has been an expedient partner to Russia in Syria for all the reasons that Ms. Borshcheskaya explained. But now you see a situation where I think Russia is trying to get Assad to perhaps make some concessions, but Iran is actively whispering in his ear to hold firm and not make concessions because they want to stay there. So there are tensions there that I think, to me, don't necessarily mean that that relationship will continue, much less get much, much stronger.
So then what do we do, Dr. Exum?
Well, actually, the one thing we haven't talked about, and it surprises me, we haven't talked about oil, and we haven't talked about
I was getting there, but go ahead.
Russia's
please.
relationship with OPEC
Yep.
in particular. Saudi Arabia has absolutely pressured Russia to distance itself from Iran, has thus far been unsuccessful. But the relationship between OPEC and Saudi Arabia and Russia, that is a relationship that has grown deeper over the past 2-3 years. I think if you were to poll, you know, analysts of the oil markets and, you know, 2 years ago and ask them if they thought that the near-term agreement between Russia and OPEC would have endured as long as it had, I think they would have been a bit surprised, but it has, and that's a relationship that's increasingly important. I think that the Saudis can be an important voice in terms of balancing Russia's relationship with Iran.
Yeah, Dr. Alterman?
And frankly, the Saudis are looking to show a tip toward Russia and China as a way to get us to back off. One of the things I heard from some Saudis in recent weeks was that Mohammed bin Salman especially is interested in demonstrating to the United States that he has other options if the United States is going to continue to talk about human rights and other kinds of things. And he is interested in showing that he can go toward Moscow or Beijing. He doesn't have to rely on Washington.
And Moscow may not lecture in the region, but for the Saudis, if their relationship with Iran is there are no strings attached, that's going to start to affect the relationship between Saudi and Russia. Let me just, Dr. Alterman, stick with you on the issue of oil. The administration has ended all waivers for purchasers of Iranian oil, including China. Do you expect China is going to stop buying all the oil it buys from Iran?
I think a couple of things are going to happen. First, the Chinese are going to smuggle some oil. They're probably going to smuggle a little more oil. Exactly how much we'll know about, I'm not sure. I think the Chinese also will pursue efforts to find workarounds to our sanctions. It seems to me that every time we use sanctions, we run the same risk that hospitals develop in having penicillin-resistant germs and everything else. If you keep using it, people will find ways to get around it, and I worry that we may be in this.
So how's it going to do it this time?
Excuse me?
How's it going to do it this time, get around the sanctions?
Well, there are ways to do things with swaps. I think the Russians, as I understand it, could do things with swaps and be selling more Urals blend oil than they're actually producing. You could set up some small things, not enough to get Iran up to its normal level of sales, but I think that the world is exploring ways to work around American sanctions.
And just one other question quickly. In recent years, Chinese-Israeli cooperation in the tech sector has surged. In 2016, Chinese investments in Israeli high-tech VC approached $1 billion. Does their growing involvement, China's growing involvement in Israel's high-tech industry raise security concerns, and should it, and is there enough attention being paid to that?
It does. The Israelis are paying more attention to it. There was a report in Foreign Policy a couple months ago saying that the Israeli National Security Council prepared a report about foreign investment, which was really about Chinese investment in Israel. I'm going over there in a couple weeks, and we'll be talking to people specifically about this issue. And frankly, I've been surprised at the level I've been able to set up meetings to talk about this issue.
All right, terrific. Thank you very much. Mr. Mast had an additional question or two.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was worried after 13 minutes. We stopped alternating sides here. So thank you for the time.
You're welcome. We just wanted to get through all the questions.
Yeah, as would I. Thank you. I would like to go back to Iran and Russia now. Got to speak earlier about China and Russia. Would love to hear from each of you. In your opinion, did the Iran deal, the JCPOA, did it bring the United States and Iran closer together, or did it bring Russia and Iran closer together through the parameters of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action?
I'll take a swing at that again. I think one of the things I think that the Iran nuclear deal did with the United States and Iran is it did open a channel of communications at very senior levels that I think had some utility. And I don't think we necessarily have the same channels at the same levels right now. So for example, where it had some utility was, I'm sure you'll recall, Congressman Mast, when our sailors found themselves in Iranian waters and were taken prisoner, essentially. That situation was resolved, I believe, more quickly than it probably would have been because there was dialogue. Beyond that, I'm not sure, I wouldn't argue that it brought the United States and Iran closer. I think, many of us who worked in government at the time didn't have a lot of illusions about the possibility that, peace and happiness was going to break out.
Did it bring Russia and Iran closer together?
My own sense is what brought Russia and Iran closer together was, frankly, the cooperation in Syria more really than JCPOA itself. That's my personal assessment.
Dr. Exum, Dr. Alterman.
Yeah, I'm doing this with some trepidation because there are very few people I respect more than Christine. But I think that the JCPOA was fine as far as addressing Iran's nuclear issue. But there were some outsized hopes within the last administration that it would open the door for a broader dialogue with Iran, and I think those hopes were unfounded. We saw plenty of evidence that the Iranians were happy to talk to us about nuclear issues and about the JCPOA and about enforcement, any issues around that. But Syria is the best example of Iran not wanting to speak about issues that didn't have to do with the JCPOA. I would agree with Ms. Warmoth that I don't see it really affecting the Iranian-Russian relationship. I think Syria was what cemented that. But I think the JCPOA, which I also supported and which I think was fine for addressing one of the three threats Iran posed, the other being its asymmetric activities and its conventional weapons buildup, it's fine for those purposes, but it did not lead towards any greater thaw in the relationship. And I just think we have to be honest about that.
Congressman, I frankly think we're going to have hostile relations with Iran for the rest of my professional career. I don't think the JCPOA would have changed that, but I think what it did is it got us on the side with all the economies of the world that matter, with a number of allies to pressure the Iranians, and the fact is the Russians and the Chinese were with us holding the Iranians to account. What it seems to me, it partly explains Russia and Iran coming together, is they both have an interest in splitting us off from our allies. And one of the things I really worry about is that we are much more isolated in the world in carrying out policy. When the administration had their meeting in Poland, it highlighted not the world's revulsion at excesses of the Iranian government, but the fact is the U.S. was adopting a policy that its allies didn't, that our policy toward the JCPOA is shared by 4 countries in the world, and all of our allies are on the other side. And that's what I really worry about in the region, is for so many of these hard problems, it feels to me like we're taking them on by ourselves, and that is exactly what opens the door to the Russians and the Chinese doing better. Where we are most powerful is when we speak for 100 countries at once. There's no country in the world besides the United States that can gather 100 countries behind it, and we're not trying to gather 100 countries behind us.
Thank you all for your thoughtful responses.
Yeah, if I could just add a comment, I agree that it was really Syria that mattered more for bringing Russia and Iran together. With regard to the JCPOA, you know, Russian officials complained for years that tough sanctions hurt the Russian-Iran trade. They really wanted trade, with the agreement, several important things happened. Now, the Kremlin had touted this as their diplomatic victory. In fact, they've tweeted that that this was Russian diplomacy. Russian diplomacy was so important in helping achieve the JCPOA. What they'd also done is they sold the S-300 to Iran immediately after the deal. That was an important element. What's also interesting is that they certainly, and the Russia-Iran dynamic is very complex. It is a very complex relationship. They were worried about the Iranian nuclear program, but also at the same time they sort of downplayed its seriousness. So that there was a very complex dynamic going on. And I just want to highlight the sale of the S-300 after the JCPOA.
Great, thanks. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today and the members who have been here to ask questions. Thanks for your testimony. Members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for you, and we ask our witnesses to please respond to those questions in writing. Excuse me, I ask my colleagues that any witness questions for the hearing be submitted to the subcommittee clerk within 5 business days. And with that, without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.